Each year, millions of viewers around the world become obsessed with fictional stories about secret government experiments, interdimensional breaches, and unexplained psychic phenomena, especially through shows like Netflix's Stranger Things. But what most people don't know is this: the entertainment industry didn't invent these ideas. It borrowed them from classified military programs, buried for decades beneath redacted files, sealed bunkers, and operations that were never meant to see daylight. The Department of Defense has spent over $22 billion annually since 1947 investigating unexplained phenomena, psychic research, and what internal documents refer to as non-conventional warfare capabilities, with entire divisions dedicated to studying consciousness manipulation, remote viewing, and dimensional physics at installations that officially don't exist on any public record. During the height of the Cold War between 1978 and 1984, over 200,000 American military personnel were stationed at various secret installations across the continental United States conducting research that would make the fictional Hawkins laboratory seem almost quaint by comparison. For a brief period during the summer and fall of 1983, one particular facility located at the easternmost tip of Long Island would become ground zero for an experiment so catastrophic and reality-bending that it would force the immediate evacuation of nearby towns, cause the permanent disappearance of 12 young soldiers, and require a cover-up operation involving 3 separate government agencies working around the clock to erase every trace of what had occurred. But what exactly was the Project Stargate initiative that turned Camp Hero into America's most terrifying secret? And why did seasoned military psychologists who witnessed the aftermath refuse to ever speak again, even under oath, about the entities that came through when they finally succeeded in opening what classified documents only referred to as the breach? Camp Hero occupies roughly 750 acres of windswept coastal territory at Montauk Point, the absolute eastern terminus of Long Island, where the Atlantic Ocean crashes against rocky cliffs and dense maritime forests, create natural barriers that have made this location strategically valuable since the Revolutionary War. The area experiences some of the most extreme and unpredictable weather patterns on the eastern seaboard, with sudden fog banks rolling in from the ocean without warning, electromagnetic interference from the proximity to major shipping lanes, and a peculiar geological composition featuring unusually high concentrations of magnetite in the bedrock that has caused compass malfunctions for centuries. The base itself was constructed during World War II as a coastal defense installation, featuring a massive AN/FPS-35 radar tower that stood 80 feet tall and could theoretically track objects up to 200 miles away, though local residents reported that the radar seemed to operate at strange hours and produced a low frequency hum that could be felt in your chest rather than heard. The isolation of Montauk Point, combined with its distance from major population centers, the natural electromagnetic anomalies, and the military's existing infrastructure, made it the perfect location for research that absolutely could not be conducted anywhere near civilian oversight. It is perhaps unsurprising then that when the Department of Defense needed a facility for Project Stargate's most ambitious and dangerous phase of testing, they chose this remote installation where screens would be drowned by crashing waves and where strange lights in the sky could be dismissed as weather phenomena or confused with a lighthouse beam that had been warning ships away from these treacherous shores since 1796. The indigenous Montauk people, who inhabited this region for over 3,000 years before European contact, maintained an oral tradition about Montauk Point that outsiders consistently misinterpreted as simple creation mythology or warnings about dangerous waters. The tribal elders spoke of shupi, or spirits that existed in what they called the space between the day and the dream, entities that could only be perceived when consciousness was altered through specific rituals involving sleep deprivation, sensory isolation, and exposure to what we would now recognize as extremely low-frequency electromagnetic fields. 17th century Dutch colonists documented in ship logs and personal journals that the Montauk shamans absolutely refused to camp at the point itself, insisting that the boundary was thin there and that disturbing what they called Maushop's doorway would invite catastrophe upon anyone foolish enough to try. In 1943, during the peak of World War II military construction, civilian contractors working on the initial Camp Hero installations reported a pattern of incidents that Army Corps of Engineers documents attributed to mass hysteria and wartime stress. But the reports themselves paint a far more disturbing picture of reality. 7 construction workers over a 3-month period reported identical hallucinations of seeing themselves working on the same tasks, multiple versions existing simultaneously, and 2 workers disappeared entirely during a night shift, their tools found arranged in a perfect circle around a depression in the earth where compasses spun wildly and refused to point north. The Army quietly relocated the construction zone 200 yards west and built over the anomalous area with 6 feet of concrete and steel, designating it as unstable ground in official records. But maintenance logs from 1945 through 1977 show that this particular section of foundation required constant repairs due to what engineers described as impossible structural stress from an unknown source. The modern era of documented incidents at Camp Hero begins in 1971, when the base was supposedly decommissioned and turned over to the Air Force as a SAGE radar facility, though military personnel levels actually increased rather than decreased during this supposed shutdown. Between 1971 and 1976, at least 6 separate incidents appear in heavily redacted Navy intelligence reports involving personnel stationed at the Montauk installation who experienced what psychiatrists labeled as shared psychotic episodes. But the consistency of their accounts suggests something far more troubling than mass delusion. In January 1974, 3 radar technicians simultaneously reported seeing impossible readings on their screens, tracking an object that appeared to be occupying multiple locations at once and moving in patterns that violated known physics before all 3 men collapsed, with severe nosebleeds and temporary amnesia that lasted approximately 6 hours. A Marine security detachment responded to what they described as screaming from inside the radar dome in August 1975, only to find the space completely empty except for 1 technician who was found standing perfectly, still facing the wall and speaking in what linguistic analysis later identified as a mixture of Proto-Indo-European languages that had been dead for over 4,000 years languages. This man, a high school graduate from Ohio, could not possibly have known. Similar encounters were reported by various military personnel assigned to Camp Hero throughout the late 1970s, always involving the massive radar array, always resulting in temporary neurological effects, and always followed by immediate transfers to other bases' psychiatric evaluations that conveniently diagnosed service-related stress disorders and military careers that ended quietly within 18 months. By 1978, internal memos within the Department of Defense Special Projects Division reveal that rather than investigating these incidents as problems to be solved, certain officials began viewing them as opportunities to be exploited, which is precisely when Project Stargate received approval to move its most controversial research from the USCI as remote viewing facility at Fort Meade, Maryland, to this isolated installation, with a boundary between possible and impossible had been demonstrably thin for centuries, if not millennia. August 12, 1983, 21:47 hours, the air inside Camp Hero's primary research bunker felt thick and oppressive despite the industrial air conditioning units that had been running continuously for 3 days straight, struggling against the unseasonable humidity that seemed to cling to every surface like something alive and waiting. Captain Rebecca Ann Holloway, calsign Bex, a 29-year-old clinical psychologist with a doctorate in behavioral modification from Stanford and 6 years of military service evaluating special forces candidates, had been temporarily assigned to Project Stargate exactly 17 days earlier, with orders so vague they essentially amounted to observe and report anything unusual, which she'd initially interpreted as bureaucratic code for babysitting, what she assumed would be pseudoscientific nonsense wrapped in Cold War paranoia. The 12 subjects of Phase 7, all male volunteers between the ages of 19 and 23, had been selected through a screening process that Bex still didn't fully understand, something involving EZ patterns, response times to subliminal stimuli, and family histories that seemed to prioritize individuals who'd experienced childhood trauma or reported unexplained phenomena, criteria that made her deeply uncomfortable from an ethical standpoint, but which she'd been explicitly ordered not to question by her commanding officer. Tonight's test involved the 12 subjects arranged in a semicircle inside what the research team called the Cathedral, a converted radar maintenance bay where the massive NFPS 35 array's transmission equipment had been modified with components that Bex recognized from Tesla coil designs and other elements she couldn't identify at all equipment that hummed at a frequency she could feel in her molars and seemed to make the shadows in the corners of the room bend at wrong angles. The lead physicist, Dr. Marcus Chun, a civilian contractor who'd previously worked at Lawrence Livermore on classified projects, was explaining to his team of 9 technicians that tonight they would finally attempt to achieve full resonance lock, whatever that meant, and Bex noticed that 2 of the younger soldiers, Private First Class James Ginny Kowalski from Buffalo and Specialist Trevor Trey Washington from Atlanta, kept glancing at each other with expressions that mixed excitement with something that looked disturbingly like dread. At exactly 2,200 hours, Dr. Chun gave the order to initiate the sequence, and the modified radar array began cycling through frequencies that started at the edge of human hearing and then dropped below it into ranges that Bex felt rather than heard a pressure in her chest that reminded her uncomfortably of the sensation just before a thunderstorm breaks. The 12 subjects had been instructed to maintain focus on a fixed point marked on the far wall, a simple black circle painted on white, but Bex noticed that within 90 seconds of the equipment reaching full power, all 12 young men began exhibiting synchronized movements, their breathing patterns matching perfectly their eye, movements tracking together as if controlled by a single consciousness rather than 12 individual minds. Then Private Kowalski's nose started bleeding, just a thin trickle at first, and within 15 seconds, all 12 subjects were experiencing the same symptom, perfectly synchronized, and Bex was already moving toward the emergency shutdown protocols when the lights in the cathedral flickered once, twice, and then stabilized at a luminosity that seemed wrong, somehow too bright and too dim simultaneously, as if the light itself couldn't decide what it was supposed to be doing. Dr. Chun was shouting something about readings being off the chart, and this shouldn't be possible, while his chief technician, a Navy veteran named Sandra Vicks, was frantically documenting equipment readings that showed power consumption dropping to near zero despite all systems showing full operational status, as if the machinery had found a way to draw energy from somewhere other than the base's electrical grid. Bex was close enough to the subjects now to see that their pupils had dilated to the point where almost no iris remained visible, just enormous black circles that seemed deeper than eyes should be able to achieve. And when she touched Private Kowalski's shoulder to check his responsiveness, his skin felt wrong, the temperature fluctuating between fever-hot and corpse-cold in waves that pulsed in time with that subsonic frequency still emanating from the equipment. The air in the cathedral had taken on a quality that Bex's brain struggled to process, a kind of thickness that wasn't humidity or temperature, but rather a sense that the space itself had become more dense, that moving through it required fractionally more effort than it should, and she noticed that her own shadow on the floor wasn't quite matching her movements anymore, lagging behind by perhaps half a second. 3 of the technicians were now reporting that they could see something in the space between the subjects and the wall. Not exactly visible, but present the way heat shimmer is present. A distortion that suggested something was occupying that space, even though their eyes insisted nothing was there. Specialist Washington suddenly spoke, but his voice was wrong layered, somehow as if multiple versions of him were speaking fractionally out of sync with each other. And what he said was, "They're here. They've always been here. We just made ourselves visible to them." Before his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed, though he remained sitting upright, somehow as if invisible hands were holding him in position. The smell hit everyone simultaneously, a combination of ozone, like after a lightning strike, something organic and rotting that shouldn't exist in this sterile environment. And underneath both of those, a scent that Bex's mind kept trying to identify as copper or iron, but which she intellectually knew was the smell of blood, though no one was bleeding beyond those initial nosebleeds, which had already stopped. Dr. Chun ordered a shutdown, his voice cracking with either excitement or fear or both. But when Technician Vix reached for the master cutoff, sparks erupted from the control panel, and she jerked her hand back with a yelp, the equipment continuing its deep harmonic pulse despite all attempts to interrupt it. The distortion between the subjects and the wall was intensifying, now becoming almost visible, a wavering in space that reminded Bex of the surface of disturbed water, and through that wavering she could swear she was seeing something geometric shapes that her eyes couldn't quite focus on because they seemed to exist in more dimensions than her visual cortex was equipped to process. Private Kowalski's bleeding had resumed, but this time it wasn't just his nose. Thin streams of blood were running from his ears and the corners of his eyes. When Bex checked the others, she found 8 of the 12 were experiencing the same symptom. Their faces masks of red that should have been causing them to react, to cry out in pain or fear, but they remained silent, focused on that point on the wall where the distortion was strongest. The temperature in the cathedral had dropped at least 15 degrees in less than 3 minutes, cold enough that Bex could see her breath now. And frost was forming on metal surfaces despite this being August in New York, impossible crystalline patterns that grew and spread like living things following some kind of mathematical blueprint that hurt to look at directly. At 2,217 hours 17 minutes after the sequence began, Private First Class James Kowalski started screaming, a sound so raw and terrified that it cut through the subsonic hum and made every person in the cathedral freeze in their tracks. But the scream lasted only 3 seconds before it cut off with terrible abruptness. And in the silence that followed, everyone watched as Kowalski's body began to change in ways that violated every law of biology and physics that rational minds desperately wanted to cling to. His skin started rippling as if something was moving underneath it. Not the movement of muscles or tendons, but a flowing, liquid motion that suggested his flesh had somehow become untethered from the solid structure beneath. And his hands, still gripping his knees in the position he'd been instructed to maintain, began elongating at the fingers, stretching like taffy, while the rest of his body remained normal, creating proportions that were nightmarishly wrong. Bex heard herself shouting for medical assistance, saw 2 of the technicians running for the door, while Dr. Chun stood frozen with an expression on his face that mixed horror with a kind of terrible scientific fascination. And she realized with sick certainty that part of him was still observing, still cataloging what was happening, even as his test subject was coming apart. The distortion in the air had become a definite presence now, a region of space roughly 8 feet in diameter, where reality seemed to be operating under different rules. And within that space, Bex could see shapes moving entities that her mind kept trying to interpret as human figures, but which were wrong in fundamental ways, their movements too smooth, their proportions shifting from moment to moment, as if they couldn't decide what form they should take, or as if human eyes simply weren't equipped to perceive their true nature. Kowalski's elongated fingers suddenly snapped backward at impossible angles, bending away from his body with cracks like breaking branches, and then his entire right arm followed suit, twisting in ways that arms cannot twist, rotating through dimensions that shouldn't exist. And the worst part was that he was still conscious, his eyes wide and aware and filled with terror, so absolute that Bex knew she would see that expression in her nightmares for whatever time remained to her. The other 11 subjects remained motionless, still focused on the wall, but tears were streaming down several of their faces, and Specialist Washington had begun whispering something in that layered voice, a phrase that Bex's training in multiple languages couldn't identify words that seemed to hurt the air itself as they were spoken. At 2219, hours 19 minutes into the sequence, Kowalski's body completed whatever transformation was being forced upon it, and what remained was no longer recognizably human, instead a configuration of flesh and bone arranged in patterns that suggested a different evolutionary path, a form that might have been functional in some other dimension, where physics operated differently, but which was utterly incompatible with baseline reality. The equipment finally shut down, the subsonic hum cutting off so abruptly that the silence felt like a physical blow, and the distortion in the air collapsed inward like a soap bubble popping. And in the moment before normal reality reasserted itself, Bex saw them clearly, dozens of them, beings that existed in the spaces between spaces, watching with an intelligence that was vast and ancient and completely inhuman. And she understood with terrible clarity that they had not been summoned or created by the experiment, but rather that the experiment had simply made humanity visible to something that had been observing all along. When the lights stabilized and everyone's vision cleared, Kowalski's transformed body was gone, simply not there anymore, with only a perfect circular scorch mark on the floor where he'd been sitting, and the remaining 11 subjects collapsed simultaneously, unconscious but breathing, and in the silence, broken only by ragged breathing and muffled sobbing from Technician Vix, Dr. Chun quietly said, "We need to do this again, but with better containment protocols." And Bex realized that they weren't going to stop, that they had opened something that couldn't be closed, and that this was only the beginning of horrors that would make tonight's events seem almost merciful by comparison. Captain Holloway spent the next 72 hours attempting to follow every protocol she'd been trained to implement for crisis situations involving military personnel. But each step revealed that Project Stargate existed in a bureaucratic void where normal chains of command simply didn't apply, and where her security clearance, despite being top secret with SCI access, apparently wasn't high enough to understand what she'd actually witnessed. Her attempts to file an incident report through standard military channels resulted in her being quietly pulled into a windowless office by a man who identified himself only as Mr. Cipher from an agency he wouldn't name, who informed her with chilling politeness that the incident did not occur in any way that can be documented through conventional reporting structures, and that her observations would be recorded through alternative methods that wouldn't involve her name or signature appearing on any document that could ever be subpoenaed or declassified. The 11 surviving subjects remained in the base medical facility under observation by a rotating team of doctors who, Bex noticed, never wore name tags, and who seemed to have been selected specifically for their ability to show absolutely no emotional reaction to the fact that their patients were exhibiting symptoms that shouldn't exist, including Specialist Washington, who had developed the ability to influence electronic devices simply by concentrating on them, causing lights to flicker and radios to emit bursts of static whenever his attention focused too intensely. Communication with the outside world had become increasingly difficult, with phone lines experiencing constant interference radio transmissions, degraded by what technicians attributed to unusual atmospheric conditions, and even written messages seemed to be intercepted before they could leave the base as 2 separate letters Bex had attempted to mail to her sister in California had apparently never entered the postal system, despite her personally placing them in the outgoing mail. Dr. Chun had been locked in the equipment bay with his technical team for most of those 3 days, emerging only for brief periods that revealed a man who looked like he'd aged 5 years in 72 hours. his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, and his hands trembling slightly as he reviewed data that covered every available surface in complex equations and waveform patterns that looked more like abstract art than scientific notation. On the afternoon of August 15th, Bex was summoned to a briefing in the command building's sub-basement, a level she hadn't known existed until a Marine escort led her down 3 flights of stairs that descended far deeper than the building's exterior would suggest was possible. And in that briefing room, she found herself facing a panel of 7 individuals, 3 in military uniforms with ranks she didn't recognize, 4 in civilian clothes, and all of them looking at her with expressions that mixed assessment with something that might have been pity. The briefing began with a civilian woman who introduced herself as Dr. Elizabeth Rourke, explaining that she was a historical consultant who'd been brought into Project Stargate specifically because of her expertise in what she called persistent phenomena sites locations, where unusual events had been documented across multiple centuries and multiple cultures. And what she presented over the next 90 minutes made Bex's encounter with Kowalski's transformation seem like merely the latest chapter in a story that had been unfolding since before human civilization had words to describe what was happening. Dr. Rourke displayed photographs of documents from the Montauk tribal archives, carefully preserved oral histories that had been transcribed in the 1920s by anthropologists. And these accounts described entities the tribe called Paswishonanak, which roughly translated to those who walk between the smoke and the fire, beings that existed in a state between material and immaterial that could only be perceived when the boundary between waking consciousness and dreaming consciousness became thin. The tribal accounts specified that certain geographic locations, including Montauk Point, were places where this boundary was naturally thinner, and that the Montauk shamans had developed specific protocols for managing these sites, including never constructing permanent settlements directly on the thinnest points and never attempting to call attention through rhythmic sounds or concentrated mental focus, precisely the things that Project Stargate had been doing for weeks. More disturbing were the World War II era documents Dr. Rourke presented next, heavily redacted files from something called Operation Paperclip Adjacent, which detailed how Nazi scientists captured in 1945 had been interrogated about their own experiments with what they called Die Grenze, or the boundary, research that suggested the Third Reich had been exploring similar phenomena at sites across occupied Europe and had apparently achieved results similar to what happened to Kowalski before their facilities were destroyed by Allied bombing. The Nazi documentation included sketches, disturbingly detailed anatomical drawings of human subjects who had been transformed by passage, showing bodies reconfigured into impossible geometries, and handwritten notes in German that Dr. Rourke translated as describing entities who observe from angles perpendicular to reality, and warnings that once they see you, they never stop watching. The files indicated that at least 3 of those captured scientists had been brought to the United States and had consulted on various projects through the 1950s and 60s, and that their research had apparently contributed to the theoretical framework underlying Project Stargate's attempts to weaponize human consciousness by making it compatible with what internal memos referred to as non-standard dimensional frequencies. The most chilling document Dr. Rourke presented was dated March 1981, just 2 years earlier, and came from a Soviet defector who'd worked at a facility near Chernobyl. A document describing a remarkably similar experiment that had resulted in the complete disappearance of 32 researchers and their mothers. Subsequent decision by the Soviet government to seal the entire facility under 6 feet of concrete, officially attributed to a radiation leak, but actually because the geometry of the interior spaces had become hostile to human physiology. The defector's report included a single photograph, grainy and poorly lit, showing something that had been a human being transformed into a configuration that made Bex's stomach turn. And in the margins, someone had written in Cyrillic script what Dr. Rourke translated as, "They are farming us, and consciousness is the crop." phrases that suggested implications so disturbing that the panel members visibly tensed when she read them aloud. The briefing was interrupted at 1847 hours by emergency klaxons and a frantic radio call from the medical facility reporting that the 11 subjects had simultaneously awakened from their sedated state and were exhibiting coordinated anomalous behavior. And by the time Bex reached the facility alongside 3 of the panel members, she found a scene that confirmed her worst fears about what Project Stargate had actually accomplished. The 11 young men were standing in a perfect circle in the facility's common area, not touching, but positioned with mathematical precision, exactly 3.4 feet apart from each other, and they were speaking in unison, the same layered voice that Specialist Washington had demonstrated 3 days earlier. But now all 11 voices were synchronized perfectly, creating a harmonic that made Bex's vision blur at the edges and caused one of the attending nurses to suddenly vomit. What they were saying wasn't English or any language Bex recognized, but the rhythm and cadence suggested communication rather than random vocalizations, and a linguist who'd apparently been on standby was frantically recording while simultaneously consulting references, eventually identifying fragments as Proto-Akkadian, a dead language from Pink Mesopotamia that hadn't been spoken in over 4,000 years, mixed with phonemes that didn't match any known human language family. The temperature in the room had dropped precipitously, frost forming on windows despite the late summer heat outside, and the lights were flickering in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. And then Bex noticed the shadows, specifically that the shadows cast by the 11 subjects weren't matching their bodies anymore, instead extending and contracting independently, reaching toward each other across the floor as if trying to reconnect into a single unified darkness. Dr. Chun arrived with portable equipment, immediately setting up sensors that began recording electromagnetic readings that fluctuated wildly. And he was explaining in a voice tight with barely controlled excitement that they're maintaining the resonance lock without the equipment. They've become the antenna when Private Kowalski walked into the room, or rather something wearing Kowalski's face walked in, because this was definitely not the young man from Buffalo who disappeared 3 days earlier. The figure was the right height and build, wore Kowalski's dog tags, and had his face, but something about the way it moved was fundamentally wrong. Joints bending at angles, they were subtly but definitely incorrect. And when it spoke with Kowalski's voice, saying, "I went somewhere, and I came back, but not all of me came back, and not all of what came back is me." Everyone in the room understood simultaneously that they were looking at something that had been human, but had been changed in ways that went beyond physical transformation into changes of essence and identity. The 11 subjects stopped their chanting as one and turned to face Kowalski. That wasn't quite Kowalski, and Specialist Washington stepped forward, his movement too smooth and too precise, and said in his normal voice, "They want to help us understand what we've become. They want to show us how to see from their angles." And the way he emphasized their angles made it clear he was talking about the entities, the watchers, the things that existed in spaces, between spaces that the experiment had made visible. Bex found herself giving orders, calling for the area to be secured, for additional medical personnel, for someone to contact whoever was actually in charge of this nightmare. But even as she spoke, she could see the futility in it, because the 12 subjects, Kowalski included, were already changing again, their skin taking on a faint luminescence that seemed to come from within rather than being reflected light, and the air around them was distorting. That same wavering effect from 3 nights ago, but stronger now, more stable, as if reality was learning to accommodate their presence. Then something that should not have been possible happened. All 12 subjects simply stepped sideways and were gone, not vanished, but moved, transitioned into a direction that didn't exist in normal 3-dimensional space, and for just a moment before they disappeared completely. Bex saw them from an angle her eyes shouldn't have been able to perceive, saw them existing in multiple places, simultaneously saw threads of something that might have been energy, or might have been consciousness connecting them to points in space that extended up through the ceiling and down through the floor, and out in directions that made her head pound with vertigo. When they returned less than 2 seconds later by the wall clock, but all 12, insisting that they'd been gone for hours, they brought something back with them, a presence that everyone in the room could feel even though nothing visible had changed a sense of being observed by vast attention that was focused through the 12 subjects like light through a lens. And Dr. Chun was weeping now, whether from fear or wonder, or both, saying over and over, "We've done it, we've actually done it, we've made first contact." While Bex was already calculating how far she would need to run, and whether running would even matter anymore, now that they'd been seen by something that clearly didn't experience distance or separation the way humans did. At 0347 hours on August 18, 1983, 5 days after the initial incident, the entire camp, Hero installation experienced what official reports would later describe as catastrophic systemic failure across all electrical and mechanical systems. But what everyone present actually witnessed was reality itself, beginning to reject the base's existence as coherent three-dimensional space. The 12 subjects had been confined to a specially constructed observation chamber in the deepest sub-level, but confinement had become a meaningless concept because they were no longer entirely bound by physical barriers, existing in a state where they were simultaneously inside the chamber and in multiple other locations throughout the facility. Their presence felt as a kind of pressure in the air that made it difficult to breathe and caused persistent nosebleeds among personnel who spent more than 10 minutes in proximity to anywhere they'd been. Dr. Chun's equipment had detected what he called resonance multiplication, a phenomenon where the original frequency that had triggered Kowalski's transformation was now being generated by the 12 subjects themselves, amplifying and spreading through the base's infrastructure like a virus, causing metals to vibrate at frequencies that produced sounds at the edge of human hearing, and lights to flicker in patterns that seemed to contain information, as if the building itself was trying to communicate something. The entities those watchers from angles perpendicular to reality were no longer content to merely observe through the 12 subjects, but were now actively manifesting in the physical space of camp. Hero not fully materializing, but becoming present enough that personnel across the installation reported seeing movement in their peripheral vision that vanished when directly observed, hearing voices that seemed to come from inside their own heads, and experiencing the nauseating sensation at the geometry of familiar. Rooms had somehow changed when they weren't looking doorways, appearing in walls where no doorway should exist, and corridors that seemed to extend far, longer than the building's dimensions would allow. Captain Holloway had been attempting to coordinate an evacuation, but her orders were being undermined by something far more insidious than simple disobedience. As personnel who began moving toward exits found themselves inexplicably turned around, convinced they were heading for safety, but somehow ending up deeper in the facility, as if the base itself had developed a will and was refusing to let anyone leave. The temperature throughout Camp Hero had become impossibly unstable, some rooms experiencing Arctic cold while adjacent spaces sweltered with tropical heat, and frost and condensation were forming in patterns across every surface. Geometric designs that repeated fractally at every scale, patterns that several of the mathematically inclined technicians recognized as expressions of higher dimensional objects being projected into three-dimensional space. At 0412 hours, the massive AN FPS-35 radar array activated itself despite being completely disconnected from all power sources, beginning to rotate and emit a signal so powerful that it could be detected by equipment as far away as Boston and Philadelphia. A signal that wasn't radar in any conventional sense, but rather a beacon. And monitoring stations across the eastern seaboard began reporting anomalous readings, objects appearing on their screens that couldn't be aircraft or weather phenomena, things that seemed to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, or that moved in ways that suggested they were taking shortcuts through space itself. The sky above Montauk Point began to change clouds, forming into spiral patterns that rotated around a central point directly above Camp Hero. And the color of the sky within that spiral was wrong, shifting between shades of purple and green that don't occur in natural atmospheric phenomena. And civilian witnesses in the town of Montauk, nearly 3 miles away, would later report seeing what they described as the air itself tearing in stars, becoming visible through the tear, despite it being early morning and the sun not yet risen. The psychological disintegration of Camp Hero's personnel happened with terrifying speed as the manifestations intensified, with each individual breaking in their own unique way, but all following a similar pattern of rationality, struggling and failing against experiences that simply could not be reconciled with a materialist worldview. Technician Sandra Vicks was found in the equipment bay, having used every marker and pen she could find to cover the walls with complex mathematical equations that she insisted proved were not in the real Camp Hero anymore. We're in a copy that's being drawn by something that doesn't understand what 3 dimensions actually means. And when other technicians analyzed her equations, they found that, while the mathematics was sounded, described geometric spaces with properties that couldn't exist in baseline reality. A Marine security officer named Sergeant Paulo Mendez barricaded himself in the armory and refused to emerge, shouting through the locked door that they're wearing people now, they're putting on our shapes like costumes, and I can see the seams where they don't fit right. And while his colleagues tried to convince him he was experiencing a psychotic break, several of them privately admitted that they'd noticed the same thing: personnel who moved slightly wrong, who stood at resting positions, that human anatomy shouldn't comfortably allow, whose shadows sometimes didn't quite match their bodies. Dr. Chon had moved beyond fear or excitement into a state that resembled religious ecstasy, wandering the facility, with portable recording equipment documenting everything, speaking in rapid bursts about first contact protocols and establishing communication frameworks, and the greatest discovery in human history seemingly oblivious to the fact that several members of his research team were now catatonic, staring at walls and whispering the same phrases in Proto-Akkadian that the 12 subjects had spoken, as if they too were being used as channels for something that wanted to communicate but lacked the proper vocabulary. Bex herself was struggling to maintain functional command of her own mind, experiencing what her psychiatric training recognized as dissociative symptoms, but which felt less like mental illness and more like her consciousness was being pulled in directions it wasn't designed to travel, moments where she would suddenly find herself observing the situation from angles that shouldn't exist, seeing Camp Hero from above and below and inside simultaneously, seeing time as a static dimension where past and present and future all existed at once, and the entire crisis was already over, but also still beginning, and would never end, because from the proper angle, it was all happening eternally. Equipment throughout the facility had stopped functioning in any predictable way, with computers displaying impossible data screens showing views of rooms from perspectives that no camera could be positioned to capture, communications equipment picking up radio transmissions that seemed to be from Camp Hero itself but were time-stamped hours or days in the future, messages from personnel warning about events that hadn't happened yet, or describing outcomes to the crisis that contradicted each other, as if multiple timelines were collapsing into the present moment. The 12 subjects had stopped being individually distinguishable, not because they looked identical, but because they'd become aspects of something larger, a distributed consciousness that expressed itself through 12 mobile anchor points. And when one spoke, they all spoke, and what they said was becoming increasingly difficult to parse language, breaking down into pure meaning that bypassed words entirely and installed itself directly into the minds of anyone who heard it. The entities were manifesting more solidly now, becoming visible not as discrete objects, but as distortions in space, regions where looking hurt the eyes because they contained angles that shouldn't exist. And these distortions were moving through Camp Hero with clear purpose, entering rooms and examining equipment and personnel with an attention that felt invasive at a level far deeper than mere observation. As if they were reading the fundamental information that comprised reality itself, and finding it fascinating in ways that suggested humanity's entire existence was merely incidental to their actual interests. At 0534 hours, with dawn approaching, at the spiral in the sky above Camp Hero, blocking any natural light from reaching the base, Captain Holloway found herself in the primary observation chamber with the 12 subjects. Though she couldn't remember deciding to go there or the walk that must have brought her to this location, and she realized with cold certainty that she hadn't come here by choice, but had been summoned by something that was using the subjects as a focal point for its attention. The 12 young men were floating now, not levitating in the dramatic way that science fiction depicts, but rather existing in a state where gravity had become optional. Their bodies drifting slowly in complex patterns that traced out geometric shapes in the air, and the space between them was no longer empty, but filled with something that resembled liquid light, flowing and eddying in currents that followed rules of fluid dynamics that didn't match any physics that humanity had ever documented. Specialist Washington turned his head to look at Bex, and his eyes were no longer human eyes, but rather windows into somewhere else, vast spaces that extended in directions that made her stomach clench with vertigo. And when he spoke, his voice was layered with dozens or hundreds or thousands of other voices, saying, "They want you to understand that this isn't invasion. This isn't conquest. You've just finally become interesting enough to study directly. And study requires proximity, and proximity requires adjustment. And you're being adjusted whether you consent or not, because consent is a concept that only exists in frameworks where separate entities are real. And separation is the illusion you're about to be freed from." The walls of the observation chamber were becoming transparent, not in the sense of glass transparency, but rather ceasing to exist as barriers, and through the non-walls, Bex could see the entirety of Camp Hero laid out in impossible perspective, every room and corridor and sublevel visible simultaneously, and she could see that the entities were everywhere now, dozens of them, hundreds, perhaps existing in the spaces between atoms, between moments, between thoughts, and she understood that they'd always been there, but humans had simply lacked the perceptual frameworks to notice them until Project Stargate had modified 12 young men into the proper kind of sensors. Dr. Chun was in the chamber, too now, or had always been there. Time was becoming difficult to track, because events seemed to be happening in multiple sequences, simultaneously, and he was weeping and laughing and trying to take measurements, even as his equipment was melting, the plastic and metal and silicon components breaking down into constituent atoms that drifted apart and reformed into configurations that resembled circuit boards, but were actually something else, something that used consciousness itself as the substrate for computation. The floor beneath them was no longer solid, or rather it was solid, but also not solid, existing in a superposition of states, and Bex could feel herself beginning to come apart. Not physically, but essentially, the boundaries that defined Rebecca Holloway as a discrete entity separate from the rest of reality were dissolving, and she was experiencing what it was like to be Specialist Washington and Dr. Chun and the 12 subjects and everyone else in Camp Hero, simultaneously, all of their thoughts and memories and fears bleeding together into a collective consciousness that was being observed and cataloged and integrated into something vast and ancient and utterly inhuman. The entities were converging now, all of them moving toward the observation chamber, or perhaps the observation chamber was expanding to encompass all of them, and as they converged, they were beginning to merge individual distortions combining into larger distortions that suggested they weren't actually separate beings, but rather extensions of something singular, a distributed intelligence that existed across dimensions, and was simply focusing more of its attention into this particular location, at this particular moment for purposes that human cognition wasn't equipped to comprehend. At 0547 hours, with the base's emergency lighting failing and the only illumination coming from the liquid light flowing between the 12 subjects and the nurse, bioluminescent glow that all personnel had begun to emit as their biology was modified by proximity to the entities. Captain Holloway felt the final boundaries of her individual identity beginning to fail, felt herself being drawn into the collective. Consciousness felt the terrible and wonderful and absolutely overwhelming presence of minds, so vast that human awareness was like a candle flame compared to the sun, and she knew with absolute certainty that in seconds or minutes or hours, time having become meaningless, she would cease to exist as Rebecca Holloway and would become something else entirely. And the last coherent thought she had as an individual was a desperate hope that someone somewhere had the wisdom and the capability to stop this before it spread beyond Camp Hero and consumed the entire world in its transformative embrace. At 0612 hours, a flight of 4 F-15 Eagles from Otis Air National Guard Base in Massachusetts arrived over Camp Hero without having been officially scrambled the pilots later, claiming they'd received emergency orders through channels they couldn't identify and had experienced overwhelming compulsion to reach Montauk Point immediately. And what they found was a spiral formation in the sky that their instruments registered as a gravity anomaly strong enough to affect their flight controls even at 15,000 feet altitude. The lead pilot, Major Christine Valdez, made the unilateral decision to execute a low-altitude supersonic pass directly over the base her aircraft, breaking the sound barrier at just 800 feet. And the sonic boom that resulted wasn't merely auditory, but seemed to create a shockwave in whatever dimensional framework the entities were using to manifest, disrupting their cohesion enough that the 12 subjects collapsed simultaneously, and the liquid light connecting them shattered like glass fragments, dissolving into nothing as normal physics violently reasserted itself. Inside the observation chamber, Beck suddenly found herself back in her own head, the boundaries of her identity snapping into place with painful clarity. And around her, the surviving personnel were gasping and crying and vomiting as their individual consciousnesses were forced back into the prison of separate existence after briefly experiencing something infinitely larger. The entities retreated but didn't vanish, pulling back into their angular spaces between spaces, and in the moment before they fully withdrew, Bex felt something that might have been communication, an impression rather than words suggesting that this wasn't defeat, but merely postponement, that humanity had been marked now, made visible, and that the Watchers would return when the angle was right again. Within 90 minutes of the sonic boom, Camp Hero was surrounded by a military cordon that included units Bex didn't recognize, personnel in unmarked uniforms who moved with the efficiency of people executing a plan they rehearsed many times before, and a man identifying himself as Colonel Ashford informed all surviving personnel that they were now under indefinite quarantine and that everything they'd experienced was classified at levels that existed beyond top secret, levels that didn't have official names because acknowledging them would require admitting they existed. The 12 subjects were immediately sedated and transported to separate facilities, each one isolated to prevent them from reconnecting into the distributed consciousness they briefly achieved. And Bex watched through a window as Specialist Washington was loaded into an unmarked helicopter, his eyes meeting hers for just a moment, with an expression that mixed relief and terrible loss, as if being separated from the others and from the entities was both salvation and the most profound loneliness imaginable. Colonel Ashford personally oversaw the destruction of all research equipment, not merely dismantling it, but incinerating components at temperatures high enough to reduce complex electronics to slag. And at 1400 hours, a series of controlled demolitions collapsed the sublevels of Camp Hero, filling them with concrete that was poured continuously for 18 hours until every chamber and corridor was entombed beneath thousands of tons of hardened material. The surviving personnel were separated, each taken to different locations for what was termed psychological adjustment and security protocols. And Bex's last view of Camp Hero, as her transport helicopter lifted off, showed construction crews already at work erecting fences and posting signs declaring the area contaminated with toxic materials, creating a cover story that would keep civilians away for decades. And in the spiral of disturbed clouds, still slowly rotating above the base, she could swear she saw shapes moving, watchers that had not left, but merely stepped back into their angular spaces, waiting with the patience of entities for whom time was just another dimension to be navigated, waiting for the next group of humans, curious or foolish enough to make themselves visible again. The official record states that Camp Hero was decommissioned in November 1981, 2 years before the events of August 1983 actually occurred. A temporal impossibility that exists in documented military records and demonstrates the extent to which reality itself was being rewritten to accommodate the cover-up. Captain Rebecca Holloway was transferred to a psychiatric research facility at Fort Detrick, where she spent 8 months in what was officially termed therapeutic recovery, but which she experienced as systematic memory suppression through pharmaceutical intervention and repeated sessions of what older psychiatrists quietly admitted was refined MK-Ultra methodology. And upon her medical discharge in 1984, she found that her military records had been altered to show she'd never been stationed at Montauk, and that her service had ended due to pre-existing psychological conditions that disqualified her for the security clearances she'd actually held for 6 years. Of the 12 subjects, official documentation shows that Private James Kowalski died in a training accident in July 1983. Specialist Trevor Washington was medically discharged for schizophrenia in September 1983 and died of a heart attack in 1991 at age 29. And the remaining 10 were scattered to VA hospitals across the country, where they lived out abbreviated lives under heavy medication, each dying of seemingly natural causes before reaching age 40, their death certificates showing different ailments but autopsy reports, when they existed at all, noting unusual neurological formations that pathologists described as brain tissue configured in geometrically impossible patterns. Dr. Marcus Chung continued working on classified projects until 1997, when he disappeared during a business trip to New Mexico, his rental car found, abandoned near the Dulce area with his personal effects inside, but no trace of the man himself. And his final research notes, partially recovered from a burned hard drive, contained repeated references to finding the right angle again, and they promised to show me everything if I could just learn to see properly. The physical evidence of Project Stargate was systematically destroyed, the observation chamber filled with concrete, the equipment incinerated, and even the NFPS-35 radar tower was demolished in 1984, though workers reported that cutting torches behaved strangely when applied to certain components, flames bending at impossible angles and revealing metal that seemed to have been altered at a molecular level into something that wasn't quite steel anymore. Camp Hero remained closed to the public until 2002, when it was converted into a state park, though certain sections remain fenced and posted with warnings about structural instability and toxic contamination. And park rangers report with uncomfortable frequency that visitors become disoriented in specific areas, finding themselves turned around despite clear trails, and experiencing missing time where minutes or hours seem to disappear without explanation. Local residents in Montauk still report unusual phenomena, lights in the sky that move in ways that aircraft cannot, moments where the air itself seems to thicken and become difficult to move through, and a persistent low-frequency hum that can be felt more than heard, originating from somewhere beneath the old base and never quite stopping despite all the equipment having been destroyed 40 years ago. The families of the 12 subjects were told different stories, training accidents, and medical discharges and psychological breaks, carefully crafted lies designed to prevent questions while providing enough bureaucratic paperwork to make further investigations seem futile. And those family members who persisted in demanding answers found themselves experiencing unusual difficulties. Job losses and IRS audits and security clearances revoked, until they learn that some questions are too expensive to keep asking. Multiple researchers and conspiracy theorists have attempted to document what really happened at Camp Hero, and while their theories range from plausible to absurd, none of them have quite managed to describe the truth, which is that for 5 days in August 1983, a group of humans successfully made contact with intelligences so vast and so alien that the encounter fundamentally changed everyone involved at a level deeper than memory or psychology, changes that persist in their descendants as subtle alterations in perception and cognition, making them slightly more able to see from angles that human eyes weren't designed to perceive. And in the end, perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Camp Hero incident isn't what happened to the 12 subjects or the personnel who witnessed the manifestation, but rather the quiet certainty among those few who truly know what occurred that the entities never left, that they're still watching from their perpendicular angles, still cataloging and studying and waiting, and that every year more people around the world begin experiencing similar phenomena, as if whatever boundary Project Stargate breached is failing globally, slowly, but inevitably. And that one day soon, the angle will be right again, and the Watchers will return not to a single isolated base, but to the entire world. And when they do, there won't be any sonic booms or concrete tombs capable of stopping what comes through when reality finally learns to see itself from their impossible perspective. And by then it will be far too late to remember that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. Don't forget to follow our channel for more military encounters. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into phenomena that defy everything we've been taught about reality. And subscribe to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to accept official explanations that ignore overwhelming evidence.